Napoleon Bonaparte, born on the small island of Corsica, is one of the most famous men to have ever lived, hailed as the man of the 19th century. Even his very name is used as a word to describe something momentous, colossal, Napoleonic. A rags to riches story, Napoleon was only 24 years old when he became a general, and 35 when he crowned himself Emperor of the French. Charismatic leader of men, shrewd politician, and a military genius, Napoleon fought 60 battles in his career and only lost 7 of them, making him the most victorious general in history. Not since the days of ancient Rome and the Caesars had one man conquered so much of Europe, or held so much power. As a ruler of France and its empire for nearly 15 years, Napoleon was also a reformer and improver. He played a leading role in solidifying the gains and ideals of the French Revolution, promoting equality and careers open to talent, securing religious freedom and tolerance, ending aristocratic and feudal privilege, and founding the Civil Code, a unified and progressive code of laws which are still in use across Europe to this day. Napoleon's empire helped provide the basis of what is today the European Union. For this reason, Napoleon is often considered the father of modern Europe, and ever since him, the world was never really the same. To this day, Napoleon remains one of the most written about men in history, second only to Jesus Christ, inspiring masterpieces of music, art, literature and poetry, from Beethoven's stirring Third Symphony to Tolstoy's War and Peace. Few fictional characters have ever done as much as Napoleon Bonaparte. The so-called man of destiny and a mass of contradictions, Napoleon is still something of an enigma, both a hopeless romantic idealist and the bitterest of cynics. The combination of his irresistible charm when he chose to deploy it, his iron will, workaholic habits, inspirational speeches and sayings, sheer intellect, and of course his fiery temperament, captivated or alarmed. To some he was a god, to others the Antichrist. And his meteoric rise and then crushing downfall has been compared to a Greek tragedy. After less than 15 years in power, in the last of 7 wars formed against him by coalitions of European monarchs, Napoleon was finally defeated at the Battle of Waterloo and exiled to the remote rocky island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. At the end of his life, reflecting on his misfortunes, Napoleon's analysis was, "I have too much ambition and a spirit afire." This is the story of Napoleon and the dawn of a new age. The rise of an obscure Corsican boy to the very pinnacle of fame and fortune, from soldier to statesman to emperor, has spellbound generation after generation. Now engaged to a provincial heiress, Désirée Clary, Napoleon had been forced to rush to Paris to petition for a different army posting, not one carrying out a brutal civil war in France itself. But Napoleon would have no such luck. He would be forced to linger in Paris that whole summer, on the brink of despair, until, once again, political turmoil and being in the right place at the right time would thrust Napoleon into the limelight. The day of the 13th Vendémiaire would prove the most decisive and one of the most controversial events in Napoleon's life. Napoleon found Paris alarmingly expensive. His annual pay of 15,000 livres mostly went on supporting his mother and sisters and paying Louis's school fees. So Napoleon sold his carriage and moved to a cheap hotel on the left bank, on one of Paris's narrowest and most despised streets, Rue de la Huchette. He could no longer afford to replace his threadbare uniform and had to give up wearing gloves as a useless expense. As soon as he arrived in Paris, Napoleon went to visit the War Minister Aubry, who was busy purging the army of political undesirables. Augustin Robespierre had described Napoleon as an officer of transcendent merit. That was enough to make Aubry suspect him. When Napoleon still refused to join the Army of the West, which was engaged in a bloody civil war, and he asked for a different position. Aubrey coolly struck his name off the list of artillery officers, the elite of the army, and transferred him to the infantry, a form of downgrading so insulting that Aubrey had found it most effective so far in provoking the resignation of many undesirable officers. Napoleon was shocked and pained, but he did not resign. Instead, he asked for 2 months' sick leave. Only a few months before, Napoleon had defined happiness as the greatest possible development of one's abilities, and now Paris seemed bent on the greatest possible hindrance of Napoleon's abilities. In his squalid left-bank hotel, just as his army career seemed hopelessly hampered, Napoleon thought of the charming Clary family, and the more things went wrong, the more he sought compensation in his feelings for his fiancée, Eugènie. Indeed, Napoleon became infatuated with her. He began to feel that he was a failure as a soldier, and that love alone mattered. In a blatant attempt to make her jealous, Napoleon wrote to her, "I saw many pretty women of agreeable disposition at Marmont's house in Châtillon, but I never felt for an instant that any of them could measure up to my dear good Eugènie." Wherever he went, he carried a lock of her hair in a locket, and he continued to encourage her musical talent, sending her extracts from the new operas, and romances that are pretty and sad. You will enjoy singing them if you feel as I do. But the woman he loves, or thinks he loves, or claims he loves, now rarely answers his letters, and now he was the one to worry that she was going cold when her letters did not arrive. 2 days later he wrote again, "Adored friend, I have received no more letters from you. How could you go 11 days without writing to me? I know that you will always retain an affection for your friend, but it will be no more than affectionate esteem." His letters to her became increasingly gloomy, lamenting that they provided one of the few instances of happiness in his uncertain and unhappy existence. Napoleon wrote to Joseph, "Life is an empty dream which vanishes. We have lived so many years together, so closely united, that our hearts are mingled, and you know better than anyone how entirely mine belongs to you. Désirée has asked me for my portrait, and I'm getting it done for her. You can give it to her if she still wishes for it. If not, keep it for yourself." Soon, Désirée travelled with her sister and Joseph to Genoa to live there for a few months with them. "It must be," Napoleon wrote to Joseph, "that you have to cross the river Leith to get to Genoa, for Désirée has never written to me since her arrival." Napoleon returned to the charge again, still complaining that he had received no letters. "I have had not a line from Désirée since she's been at Genoa. I believe that you keep me in the dark about Désirée on purpose. I don't even know whether she's alive or dead." Then Napoleon grew more and more impatient. "Write to me oftener. You never tell me a word about Mademoiselle Eugènie. What are you doing at Genoa? What is said there? How are you amusing yourself? I should think that it must be a very different place from this, which is the centre of science, pleasure, art, and civil liberty. Everything is horribly dear here, but this state of things will not last. My compliments to Julie, and say something to the silent lady." In Napoleon's loneliness and uncertainty, he poured out his feelings in a short story he wrote, in which he described his affection for Eugènie and sketched the life he hoped to lead with her. He kept her name for the heroine of his story, but he called his hero Clisson, a name synonymous with loyal army service. The story begins, "Clisson was born for war. While others of his age were still listening avidly to fireside tales, he was ardently dreaming of battle. Although a mere youth, he had reached the highest rank in the army. Good luck constantly aided his talents, and yet his soul was not satisfied. A man of his fervent imagination, with his blazing heart, his uncompromising intellect, and his cool head, was bound to be irritated by the affected conversation of coquettes, the games of seduction, the logic of the tables, and the hurling of witty insults. Such a paragon was only at ease communing with nature, Rousseau-like in the forests, where he felt at peace with himself, scorning human wickedness and despising folly and cruelty. To recover his spirits, he went for a month to a spa in the woods near Lyon. Here he met 2 sisters, Amélie and Eugènie. During a chance encounter in the woods, he and Eugènie fall in love. Clisson now despised his former life, where he had lived without Eugènie, without drawing every breath for her. He gave himself up to love, and renounced all thought of fame. The months and years rolled by as quickly as the hours. They had children and continued to love each other. Eugènie loved with as much steadfastness as she herself was loved. Not a sadness, not a pleasure, not a worry that they did not share. Every night, Eugènie slept with her head on her lover's shoulder or in his arms. Every day they spent together, raising their children, cultivating their garden, keeping their house in order. In his new life with Eugènie, Clisson had certainly avenged men's injustice, which had vanished from his mind like a dream. The company of a man as talented as Clisson had made Eugènie accomplished. Now her mind was cultivated, and her feelings, formerly very tender and weak, had taken on the strength and energy appropriate to the mother of Clisson's children. Then follows a sentence which is remarkably prophetic about Napoleon's own future married life. As for Clisson, he was no longer gloomy and sad. His character had taken on the sweetness and graciousness of hers. Fame in the army had made him proud and sometimes hard, but the love of Eugènie made him more indulgent and flexible. The world and mankind had quickly forgotten Clisson's achievements. Most people, living far from the sea and from nature, considered him and Eugènie either mad or misanthropic. Only poor folk appreciated and blessed them. That made up for the scorn of fools. Everything seemed set for a happy ending, but Napoleon's favourite literary form was tragedy, and he had a strong sense for the injustice in human affairs, which the Terror had surely strengthened. But perhaps Napoleon's dominant motive was that although he idealises Eugènie, he senses either that she is too young for him, or is flawed by some weakness of character. 6 years of bliss had passed when the news comes that the war had not forgotten the man who had forgotten it. Clisson is recalled to the army. The folly of mankind had broken up another happy home. He is absent from Eugènie for several years, but receives a letter from her every day. He wins victory after victory, surpassing the hopes of the people and the army. Indeed, he alone was a reason for the army's success. But then he is grievously wounded, and sends his aide-de-camp to comfort Eugènie and keep her company until he makes a full recovery. For no good reason discernible to the reader, Eugènie promptly sleeps with his aide, and her letters grow rarer and rarer and eventually stop. Clisson is heartbroken and wants to avenge the betrayal, but he cannot leave his post. He resolves to die. A battle is about to begin, and at 2 a.m. he writes to Eugènie, "How many luckless men regret being alive, yet long to continue living? Only I wish to have done with life. It is Eugènie who gave me it. Farewell, you whom I have chosen to be the master of my life. Farewell, companion of my finest days. In your arms, with you, I have tasted supreme happiness. I have drained life and the good things of life. What remains but satiety and boredom? At 26, I have exhausted the passing pleasures that go with a reputation. But in your love, I have known how sweet it is to be alive. That memory breaks my heart. May you live happily, forgetting unhappy Clisson. Kiss my sons, may they grow up without their father's warm nature, for that would make them victims like him, of other men, of glory and of love." Clisson folds this letter and entrusts it to an aide, with orders to take it to Eugènie. Placing himself at the head of a squadron, Clisson throws himself into the fray, at the point where the victory would be decided, and dies, pierced by 1,000 blows. So ends Napoleon's story of Clisson and Eugènie. What is striking is how prophetic this story is. Napoleon made his tragic ending focus on a woman betraying a man. The sense that he had been, or would be betrayed by a woman, clearly arises from some unconscious depth in Napoleon's character. In any case, Clisson's reaction is just what we would expect from Napoleon. He chooses a clean death over a shoddy life. At last, letters from Désirée do arrive, and Napoleon is delighted, though he cannot stop himself from rebuking his brother. "I have received a letter from Désirée which seems as if it had been written ages ago. You never said a word about it." Reading her latest letter, Napoleon felt convinced that she shared his feelings, a result which he had done the utmost to bring about. "Oh, my love, I love you even more if that is possible. I'm begging you, don't let a day pass without writing to me to assure me you love me." From that time onwards, Napoleon's thoughts were directed towards their marriage. "If I stay here, I may be tempted to make a fool of myself and get married. Just send me a line saying what you think about it. It might perhaps be as well to mention the matter to Désirée's brother. Tell me what comes of it, and I will abide by the result. Continue to keep me exactly informed. Tell me what you wish to do, and endeavour to arrange matters so that my absence may not hinder the attainment of the object I have at heart. This affair with Désirée must be settled one way or the other. I should be very anxious to get your reply." While this romantic idyll was in full swing, Napoleon was going through his worst period of depression so far. "As for me, I'm not especially attached to things. I approach life without grasping for it. I find myself often in the mood one enters on the eve of battle, feeling that, while death is always amongst us to put an end to all, it would be foolish to be anxious. Everything makes me indifferent to fate or destiny. In time, I shall not get out of the way when a carriage rushes past. I sometimes wonder at my own state of mind. It is the result of what I have seen and what I have risked. If Napoleon did not step under her carriage, perhaps it was because of his hope in a brooding cosmic justice. Considering that he had been treated unjustly, he began to bore his friends with tales of his grievances. He eked out a living on half pay, and proceeded to ignore the War Ministry's demands that he go to the Vendée, or provide proof of his illness, or resign his place in the army altogether. At one point, he was even accidentally struck off the list of serving generals. I fought like a lion for the Republic, and in recompense she leaves me dying of hunger. Friendship came to his aid. Marmont never left him, while Napoleon and Junot shared and paid for their attic hotel room together. Around this time, Napoleon and Talma, the famous tragic stage actor, became friends. The two would often amuse themselves by reciting ghost stories, and Talma would often give his cash-strapped friend free theatre tickets, and he even lent Napoleon some money. At his wits' end, Napoleon went to see the War Minister Aubry again, who was himself an old artilleryman who had never risen above the rank of captain. Napoleon asked for a gunner's job in the Army of the Alps. Aubry replied that Napoleon's youthful appearance did not indicate that he was born to command. "The battlefield ages men quickly," Napoleon retorted, "and that is where I come from." But Aubry was unmoved. Who, after all, was this man Bonaparte? Just another general, with 138 generals above him in seniority on the army list. In his desperate position, Napoleon thought of pulling strings. Stanislas Fréron, the loose-living journalist turned politician, was now a powerful man in France. Napoleon knew him a little from Toulon and was aware that he and his sister Pauline had fallen in love. One day, with a petition in his pocket, Napoleon went to Fréron's fine house in Paris. But when he stood on the doorstep, he could not bring himself to beg to the man who had been responsible for the butchery of hundreds of helpless people in Toulon. Napoleon sent a friend on his behalf instead, and Fréron did nothing. Napoleon took to forlornly wandering around the city, and went for dismal walks with Junot, who had also fallen madly in love with Napoleon's sister Pauline, and wished to marry her. But Junot was only a lieutenant, associated with Napoleon, a politically undesirable brigadier on sick leave. Napoleon pessimistically observed to his friend about his longed-for marriage with Pauline, "You have nothing. She has nothing. What does that total? Nothing. Your children will be born to wretchedness. Best to wait." After the downfall of the Jacobins, Paris now swarmed with royalists, notably certain incroyables, overdressed dandies who put on a lisp and effeminate English-like airs. During Napoleon's evening strolls along the boulevards, as he saw these dandies rolling in luxury, he could not refrain from voicing his contempt. Can it be that upon such creatures fortune is willing to lavish her favours? How contemptible is human nature! He used to witness these men of fashion cavorting in the Boulevard Italien, eating ices. Once, exasperated by the behaviour of a particularly rowdy incroyable while he was having lunch, Napoleon rose from his table, pushed back his chair so that it fell on the dandy's legs, and stalked off. When Napoleon's old school friend, Bourrienne, arrived back in Paris, he took Napoleon to see a new hit play to cheer him up. The play was a tragedy, followed by a comedic piece. Bourrienne's wife recalled that all the audience were convulsed with laughter, but Bonaparte alone, and I was particularly struck by it, maintained an icy silence. A little later, he disappeared without a word, and when we thought that he had left the theatre, we caught sight of him away up in the third tier, in a box by himself, with a look of savage boredom on his countenance. Napoleon usually loved the theatre, but with his military career perhaps being already over, he felt thwarted and miserable. Undoubtedly, this was one of the darkest periods of Napoleon's life. Decades later, during his exile, one night when he could not sleep, he admitted, "I was at this period, on one occasion, suffering from that extreme depression of spirits which suspends the faculties of the brain and renders life a burden too heavy to be borne. I had just received a letter from my mother, revealing to me the destitution to which she was plunged. She was then at Marseille, with no means of subsistence. I also, deprived of my salary and with exhausted resources, had but a single coin in my pocket. Urged by animal instinct to escape from prospects so gloomy, and from sorrows so unendurable, I wandered along the banks of the river Seine, feeling that it was unmanly to commit suicide, and yet unable to resist the temptation to do so. In a few more moments I would have thrown myself into the water, when I ran up against an individual dressed like a simple mechanic, who, recognizing me, threw himself upon my neck and cried, 'Is it you, Napoleon? How glad I am to see you again!' It was Alexandre de Mazy, Napoleon's best friend when he was a teenager during his garrison days. Being a nobleman, he had fled the revolution and emigrated, and had now returned in disguise to visit his elderly mother. He was about to leave me when, stopping, he exclaimed, "What is the matter, Napoleon? You do not listen to me. You do not seem glad to see me. What misfortune threatens you? You look to me like a madman about to kill himself." This direct appeal to the feelings which had seized me produced such an effect upon me that without hesitation I revealed to him everything. "Is that all?" he said, unbuttoning his coarse waistcoat and detaching a belt, which he placed into my hands. "Here are 6,000 francs in gold, which I can spare without any inconvenience. Take them and relieve your mother." I cannot to this day explain to myself how I could have been willing to receive the money, but I seized the gold as if by a convulsive movement, and almost frantic with excitement, ran to send it to my distressed mother. It was not until the money had left my hands and was on its way to Marseille that I reflected on what I had done. I hastened back to the spot where I had left Alexandre, but he was no longer there. For several days continuously, I went out in the morning and did not return until evening, searching every place in Paris where I could hope to find him. After 3.5 months of inactivity, Napoleon was finally able to write less dejectedly to a friend, "If you meet evil and nasty men, remember the good if humorous maxim of Scapin. Let us be thankful for all the crimes they don't commit." Fortunately for Napoleon, in mid-August, the War Minister Aubry was replaced by Pontecoulant. Napoleon went to see him, asked him for a job on the Italian frontier, and outlined a plan of attack. "General," said Pontecoulant, "your ideas are brilliant and bold, but they need to be examined carefully. Take time and draw me up a report." "Half an hour is enough time," Napoleon replied, and asked for a pen and 2 sheets of paper. There and then he drew up his plan for invading Piedmont, the same plan that he would put into glorious effect a few years later. The government thought well of the plan, but instead of commanding the field, they gave Napoleon a desk job in Paris, in the Historical and Topographical Bureau of the War Ministry. This office was the planning staff that coordinated French military strategy. It plotted troop movement, prepared detailed operational directives, and coordinated logistics. Here, Napoleon learnt the practicalities of high command. Despite Napoleon's difficulties, the summer of 1795 was a notoriously amusing time to be in Paris. One Swiss visitor wrote, "Pleasure is the order of the day." As Napoleon reported to his brother Joseph, "Nothing is wanting to amuse and to make life pleasant. People seem to flee from their own thoughts. And how can one look on the dark side of things when there is such a ceaseless succession of amusements and occupations to distract the mind?" The revolution had earlier found its heroes in the noble Romans of Brutus, Cicero, and the Gracchi, but the ancient shadows of the past were now ignored by the living examples of a life of dissipation and pleasure. Following the austere period of republican virtue, this new society was uprooted and cynically immoral. Paris was in the grip of what was described as a bacchanalian epidemic. Theatres reopened, cafes were crowded, dance halls and brothels sprang up everywhere. Profiteers and speculators, spending money as rapidly as they made it, sped through the streets with their women in ornately painted carriages, to expensive restaurants, gambling dens, which were all the rage, and to places of entertainment, whose private rooms were absolute sewers of debauchery and vice. Above all, the public devoted itself to dancing. People even danced in the former prisons. A ball was even held among the very tombs of the cemetery of Saint-Sulpice. Some found the dancing reaction disturbing. It was demented, neurotic, and frankly lascivious, sudden, impetuous, terrible. Parisians danced in order to forget, in order not to think, in order to remember that they were alive. An especially popular event, both riotous and macabre, was the Bal des Victimes, to which only relatives of those who had died in the terror could be invited. As if in preparation for the guillotine, men cut their hair short, and women wore theirs high upon their head, leaving the nape of the neck exposed. A narrow scarlet ribbon imitated a blood-red line around the throat, while during the dance, or when greeting each other, the head was meant to be bobbed back and forth, as if ready to fall into the executioner's basket. Around this time, Napoleon got to know Madame Tallien, the most famous woman in Paris and its leading socialite. Extraordinarily beautiful, she was, according to one admirer, an angel who lacked only wings. When Napoleon once aired his grievances to her, in particular that as he was no longer a serving general, he could not get his threadbare uniform replaced, She exerted her influence to procure him some cloth to make him a new one. Later she would joke to him, "I see you got your pants." Napoleon enthused in one letter, "Women are to be seen everywhere, in the theatre, in the park, in the library, and even very pretty ones too in the study of the savant. Here, of all places in the world, women are worthy of taking the helm. A woman should spend 6 months in Paris to find out what her power is and what is due to her. As for men, they rave about and think of and live for them alone." Désirée clearly managed to get a hold of her betrothed's letter, for she quickly wrote him an incoherent one in return. "A friend of Joseph's, a deputy, has arrived. He says that everyone enjoys themselves immensely in Paris. I hope that the noisy pleasures there will not allow you to forget the peaceful ones of Marseille, and that the walks in the Bois de Boulogne with Madame Tallien will not allow you to forget the riverside ones with your petite bonne Eugènie." Surrounded by beautiful and accomplished Parisiennes, it was inevitable that Napoleon became less attached to the unsophisticated teenage Eugènie. There, the romance of Napoleon and Eugènie stopped short. The question of marriage still remained unresolved. Napoleon's matrimonial ideas were undergoing some change amidst the sophisticated Parisian society he had just entered. Even though he was poor, Napoleon's horizons were extending, and that summer he first ventured into the high society of the Luxembourg, rubbed shoulders with affluent and powerful men like Paul Barras, and was introduced to beautiful women like Madame Tallien. Little Désirée Clary would undoubtedly feel most uncomfortable in the company of all these fashionable men and women. In his romantic novel, Napoleon had posed the dilemma, either his career or love in the wilds. But as he came to know Paris better, he realised that here were influential women, married to generals or politicians, helping them in their careers. Napoleon calculated that it would be against his interests to marry Désirée, and even from her own point of view, it were better that she should not marry him, a penniless young army officer of uncertain future, currently living in the Paris slums. Napoleon tried to let her down gently. "Tender Eugènie, you are young. Your feelings are going to weaken, then falter. Later you will find yourself changed. Such is the dominion of time. I do not accept the promise of eternal love you give in your last letter, but I substitute it for a promise of inviolable frankness. The day you love me no more, swear to tell me. I make the same promise. If you love someone else, you must yield to your feelings." From the beginning, it had been something of a dream romance. Their relationship seemed to have been the most satisfying only when they were apart, in Napoleon's imagination. Meanwhile, although he was now being paid at least, in his office job, Napoleon felt more frustrated than ever. Desk work was even further from guns than drilling infantry in a garrison town. He was a gunner, an expert in ballistics, trajectories and the mathematics of warfare, and he wanted to serve as one. Since France would not employ his talents, he thought of joining the Russian army. He even contemplated joining the East India Company's army, to the alarm of his mother Letizia, who worried that he might do it in a moment of annoyance with the French government. Next, Napoleon thought of Turkey. The Turkish artillery was notoriously weak and ill-organised, and there was talk in Paris of sending a small mission to modernise it. Napoleon took up the idea, pressed for it, and applied to be made head of mission. He got the job. In early September his passport was made out. Napoleon was all set to leave France and go to Turkey. Once again, however, politics intervened to disrupt Napoleon's plans. The committee ordained that Napoleon could not leave the country until the end of the war, as France was far too unstable. Napoleon wrote to his brother, "The news from the south is distressing. Let us hope for a strong and well-organised government that will put a stop to all this." As the political chaos intensified, very soon, Napoleon was to be catapulted to centre stage in Paris. The convention, having stopped the use of the guillotine, found that they were unable to govern. They decided to create an executive composed of 5 directors. A new constitution was drafted along these lines, so that the principles of the revolution would be given continuity and a new effectiveness. Napoleon warmly welcomed the new constitution, and so did many Frenchmen, but many Parisians bitterly opposed it, both the extremists, who were opposed in principle to any strong middle-of-the-road government, and the royalists, who wished to put a king back on the throne, with English help if necessary. In September, the royalists were overjoyed when the Bourbon Comte d'Artois, the younger brother of the recently guillotined French king, landed in France on an English warship and was expected to join the 80,000 royalist rebels in armed rebellions across Brittany and Vendée. Tempers flared, and it soon became clear that Paris was fatally divided between the Constitutionalists, the Royalists, and the Jacobin extremists. The leader of the Constitutionalists was Paul Barras. The fourth son of a vicomte, he had served as second lieutenant in India, entered politics as a moderate, voted for Louis XVI's death, and led the march to overthrow Robespierre. The night of the 4th of October was windy and wet. Napoleon's departure for Turkey had been delayed by the crisis, and he walked through the rain to see a play. Outside the theatre he saw National Guardsmen beating their drums, calling the people to arms against the convention, and some of his friends informed Napoleon of the critical events passing. Napoleon hurried to the public gallery of the convention. Frightened members had just appointed Paul Barras Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Interior, and the audience sat listening to a vigorous speech from Freron. Freron knew that Barras was not much of a soldier. In 7 years he had never risen above second lieutenant, and would need an expert to help him defend Paris. Spotting Napoleon in the crowd, Freron turned to one of his entourage. "I know the man who can defend us, if anyone can. He is a man that will not stand upon ceremony." After his speech, Freron had a few words with Napoleon, and asked him to come to Barras' headquarters. It was midnight when Napoleon arrived there. Barras greeted the young general in his usual brusque manner. "Will you serve under me? You have 3 minutes to decide." Napoleon accepted Barras' offer. "Are you aware of the magnitude of the undertaking?" Napoleon was now in military mode, and coolly replied, "Perfectly, and I am in the habit of accomplishing that which I undertake." After weighing up the odium that might be attached to him for fighting in the streets of Paris, to Napoleon the issue presented itself in clear terms. Barras stood for the new government, the convention stood for the constitution, and the constitution stood for the principles of the revolution. On the other side were the royalists and anarchists, men who defied the constitution, which had been freely voted for by an overwhelming majority of Frenchmen. The people wanted to see an end to revolutionary anarchy, and the gains of 1789 finally consolidated into a stable system of government. If this government fell, what would become of the revolution, its principles, and its gains? Napoleon detested civil strife and had tried to avoid it, but to him this was different. The principles of the revolution were in danger, and he was being offered a clear chance to save it. The alternative seemed bleak. Defeat at the royalists' hands would have meant that the past 7 years, and its sacrifices, would have all been for nothing. The royalists would invade with the help of the foreign monarchies, march on Paris, and load France with recriminations. The monarchy and the émigrés would then return, ruling by foreign force, and probably seeking vengeance. There was not a moment to lose. The armed royalists were on the march. Napoleon immediately assembled a few colleagues. "Where are the guns?" was Napoleon's first question. 6 miles away, he was told, but it would be too late to retrieve them. The rebels had already sent their forces. Just then, Napoleon noticed a dashing young cavalry officer, who had strolled into the room and looked very sure of himself, with coal-black hair and an expensive-looking sabre clanking against his spurs. In a tone as sharp as a knife, Napoleon gave him the following order, allowing for no reply. "Take 200 horsemen, gallop to the plain of Sablon, bring back the ammunition and 40 guns you find there. Use your sabres if you have to, but get the guns." Aware of the off-handed tone he had used, Napoleon asked him for his name. "Murat," he replied. Napoleon added even more curtly, "You will answer to me. Go." In the words of his fellow officers, Napoleon here showed extraordinary aplomb and was always sure of himself, a born leader. Another eyewitness said, "From the first, his activity was astonishing. He seemed to be everywhere at once. He surprised people by his laconic, clear and prompt orders. Everybody was struck by the vigour of his arrangements, and passed from admiration to confidence, from confidence to enthusiasm." In Paris, he was a rare specialist at a time when the majority of artillery officers had emigrated, a man who could make every precious shot count. He could dominate a situation through his specialist knowledge of artillery. By 6 in the morning, Napoleon had his 40 guns. Galloping at the head of 200 troops, Murat had reached them just minutes before the royalists and had hauled the cannons back to Paris. Napoleon's task was to defend the seat of government, the Tuileries, from expected attacks. The royalist rebels numbered 30,000 men. The government had only 5,000 regular troops, plus 3,000 militiamen. They were outnumbered 5 to 1, and their allegiance was uncertain. Despite these grave disadvantages, Napoleon took 8 of the cannon, and carefully took 3 hours to place each of them north of the Tuileries. Loading these guns with case shot, Napoleon took up his post beside them. He was on foot, Barras was on horseback. All morning Napoleon waited for an attack which did not come. Light rain began to fall, then came the sound of drums, shouts, and musket fire, signals of an impending attack. At 3 in the afternoon, the Royalists mounted the assault with their best battalions. Fortunately for the members of the Convention, waiting nervously inside the Tuileries, the rebels decided to make a direct frontal attack rather than anything more subtle. These columns of armed men, marching to drums, arrived in the Rue Saint-Honoré. They turned into the streets leading to the Tuileries. Muskets blazing, bayonets fixed, they exchanged gunfire with the Convention soldiers and broke through the barricades. To Napoleon watching, it doubtless seemed like the Ajaccio revolt all over again. Napoleon rode up and down the narrow Rue Saint-Honoré, spurring on his men. For an hour the battle swayed. Then the rebels broke through by force of numbers. It was Barras who gave the order for the artillery to fire on them. The cannons blazed. Accurately aimed, their case shot blasted into the rebels round after round. The ill-led attackers made several assaults, but the artillery kept on firing. The Royalists fell back and tried to get through by other routes, only to be met with Napoleon's 6 other guns. After Napoleon's horse was shot from under him, he worked alongside his soldiers, manning 2 huge cannons himself in a large open area facing Saint Roch Church. Shots hit the facade and can still be seen faintly to this day. The whole action lasted only a few minutes. Then the rebels began to retreat. Half an hour later, with losses of 200 killed and wounded on each side, the Royalist rebellion was over. Napoleon sent his divisions into every section of Paris to disarm the inhabitants, so there was no further question of violence or regrouping. He then ordered the dead to be buried and the wounded to be carried to hospitals, and returned to his headquarters at the Tuileries. Though it was a great personal victory, Napoleon never ceased to regret this day, and tried to forget, and have others forget, that he had ever taken part in a conflict that covered the streets of Paris with the blood of his fellow Frenchmen, no matter their political principles. However, the 13th Vendémiaire was the last time that a Parisian mob would try to mount a rebellion against the government for the next 30 years, and the first time in the history of the Revolution that the standing army had been used against them. No one had dared to before then. Napoleon later wrote, "Good and upstanding people must be persuaded by gentle means. The rabble must be moved by terror." However, Napoleon himself admitted the irony of the situation. When the mob gains the day, it ceases to be any longer the mob. It is then called the nation. If it does not, why, then some are executed, and they are called the canaille, rebels, thieves, and so forth. Napoleon successfully argued that as the insurgents were now harmless, they should not be punished further, and the Convention wisely dealt with its enemies, humanely, by the standards of the era. Only 2 Vendémiaire rebel leaders were executed. When the Convention wanted to execute General Monod as a traitor, Napoleon personally intervened, and eventually obtained his acquittal. The defeat of the insurgents was a coup de grace to all the hopes of the Royalists, and seemed to establish the Republic upon a firm foundation. The victory was largely Barras's. The Republic has been saved, Barras announced proudly to the Convention, but it was acknowledged that Napoleon greatly contributed, and Freron made a speech in his honour. Citizen representatives, don't forget General Bonaparte, who had only this morning to make his clever and highly successful arrangements, and had been unjustly posted from the artillery down to the infantry. Founders of the Republic, will you delay any longer to right the wrongs to which, in your name, many of its defenders have been subjected? The representatives cheered Napoleon, and some tried to edge him up onto the platform to make his own speech. But Napoleon was still, to quote his own words, a believer in principles, not persons, and according to one observer, he nudged them aside with a look of annoyance and diffidence which pleased me. Napoleon became known as a national hero who had saved the Republic and possibly prevented civil war in France. His popularity jumped as much with the people as in political circles. His ingenious use of the artillery became the talk of the city. The end of this, the most decisive day of Napoleon's life to date, cannot occur for him until he has shared it with Joseph, so at 2 in the morning he pulled a sheet of paper towards him to write, "At last it is all over, and my first thought is to give you my news." Napoleon's energy and skill on that day had a much more distant effect. The Comte d'Artois instead of stepping ashore to France to lead the royalist guerrillas, decided to sit tight, a piece of cowardice that Napoleon found inexcusable and which confirmed his disgust for the Bourbons. From the 13th Vendémiaire onwards dates the royalists' implacable hatred of Napoleon. They even gave him a nickname, General Vendémiaire, which he was called for a while afterwards, though not to his face. Though it was intended to be derogatory, when Napoleon heard of it, he remarked, "I value the title of General Vendémiaire. It will be in the future my first title of glory." The course of the revolution had been saved from further bloodshed. Indeed, the death penalty had just been abolished, and the place where so many innocent people had been guillotined, Place de la Révolution, had just been renamed Place de la Concorde. Napoleon summed up his new hopes in letters to Joseph. "People are very satisfied with the new constitution, which promises happiness, tranquility, and a long future for France. No doubt there will gradually be a complete recovery. Only a few years are needed for that." On the 26th of October, 1795, the convention held its last sitting, and the next day the new government, called the Directory, officially began. Paul Barras had been chosen as one of the directors, and as a result was forced to lay down his army command. He recommended Napoleon, the expert with guns, to replace him in the job. To clinch the appointment, Barras flatly told his colleagues, "Promote this man, or he will promote himself without you." At 26 years old, Napoleon put on the gold-trimmed uniform of a full general and assumed the command of the Army of the Interior. He was now well off, well paid, and quite well known. Napoleon moved from his squalid Left Bank hotel into a decent, spacious house in the Rue des Capucines, which came with his new job. Among other perks was a large salary of 48,000 francs a year, a splendid coach with 4 horses, and headquarters in the beautiful Place Vendôme. Forgotten were all his past worries and plans for Turkey. "Now our family shall want for nothing," he wrote home. To his mother Letizia, Napoleon hastily sent 50,000 louis. For Joseph, he secured a diplomatic appointment as consul in Italy. For Lucien, a post as commissioner with the Army of the North. Louis became a lieutenant in Napoleon's old regiment, and a month later became one of his burgeoning team of aides-de-camp. Jerome was sent to an expensive Irish boarding school near Paris, where Napoleon, mindful of his own penniless school days, spoiled him outrageously by loading him with pocket money. "You know," Napoleon wrote to Joseph, "I live only for the pleasure I can give my family." It was only the beginning. From this day, the interests of his whole family were blended with his own. During his reign, this was to have mixed, if not occasionally disastrous results. From now on, Napoleon was welcomed into the most brilliant circles in Paris. The much talked about hero of Vendémiaire found himself a centre of interest in salon society. The man who was destitute just a few days before now drove around Paris in a fine carriage, bought new clothes and eau de cologne to wear, invited guests to his private box at the opera, and gave lavish parties at his headquarters. Although Napoleon's clothing improved along with his bank account, his lack of social niceties may have proven a hindrance if this were Habsburg Vienna or Papal Rome. But in Paris of the late 1790s, originality and individualism was far more appreciated than condemned. Although he rarely took part in the centering discussions at the salons, when he did speak out, it was with sudden abandon and charm, sometimes vivacity, that surprised and sometimes captivated others. One woman describes him, "I perceived at once that he was a man of genius, or at all events, someone very much out of the common run. When I had seen this general of such a curious name some 3 or 4 times, I ceased to find fault with him. He merely struck me as a provincial inclined to overdo the fashion. But in spite of this absurdity, he seemed to be a man who might possess considerable merit. Bonaparte had a very engaging expression, which used to light up his features as he talked." Another reason that, if he had not been so thin as to give him a sickly air, which was quite pitiful to see, one would have realized that he had unusually fine features. The lines of his mouth in particular were full of charm. An artist, one of David's pupils, said that Napoleon's features were of the classical Greek mould, and that gave me respect for him. Any physical description of Napoleon, then as now, was a result of the person's usually strong opinion of him. His enemies, those who disliked or came to dislike Napoleon, often the upper classes, emphasized his thinness at this time, his pallor and shabby uniform, or his dog-eared shoulder-length haircut. Whereas those who liked, admired, or were impressed by Napoleon compared his looks to the marble heads of the Greeks and Romans, describing his large almond-shaped expressive eyes, almost femininely so, framed by overarching brows, or his aristocratic nose, high cheekbones, and broad forehead. Overall, they described it as an imposing face, especially the eyes. In manner, what his critics saw as startling, his admirers saw as arresting and purposeful, and recalled how people immediately noticed this man when he entered a room. But all agreed that young Napoleon was usually tense, rarely relaxed, and that his demeanour revealed an eager and restless spirit within, with a vast drive and an indomitable will. Men and women alike understood that here was a man driven and going places. Napoleon may not have had the superficial appeal of General Hoche, or the vast fortune of the banker Ouvrard, or the power of Paul Barras, but he offered the impression to some women that he was seething with passion, which the right woman might tame, or at least taste. One person who did notice him was Rose de Beauharnais, the woman of his destiny, known to history as Josephine.